All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hello. Welcome everyone to another Just Chatting stream. We've been a little bit absent for a couple of months. We took a break in January. There was not a huge amount of new stuff coming in the weeks December, January, and early Feb. I mean, there are some aspects which look. We'd covered some of those stories already, all that sort of stuff, and so felt there's no need to dive back in. We also looked at some other stuff which was coming up, which it's probably too sensitive, that irrespective of what position or no position someone takes on some of these issues, it's inflammatory. And it's not being helped by how badly these sort of issues are being reported on, both in traditional and non-traditional media, and as a result, it's very difficult to get even an unbiased viewpoint or a non-slanted viewpoint to at least assess what's going on, and then how quickly things are reversed when it's then found out, oh no, that this didn't actually happen, or it did happen. The conspiracy theorists were right. Look, some of these things, we're just better off not touching on, because it's very hard to get in and talk about that sort of stuff without it becoming difficult. Now, we're going to start today. Oh, I missed the just streaming. Could have been that one. Anyway, we're going to be starting today. If it comes up. Here we go. Okay, so this is one of the stories I wasn't originally going to revisit. We talked about it end of last year, and I thought, well, that's enough. There's no requirement to carry on and talk about it. Got a comment or two on the previous video on it, and it's like, well, conveniently, there was a follow-up article which came out, well, quite literally 2 days ago, as continuation of the court case. So, for those who missed the first article, what happened was there is an erotica author from Sydney who had written a book that has yet to be published, that incorporated age play. And they were consenting adults, but were age playing people of a much younger age bracket. And the question was then raised when she sent the book out to proofreaders. One of them then reported it to police, and then she's subsequently been investigated, taken to court, and this is where we are. And the question that is, I guess, at the core of it is, where does the societal line on decency fall? She's clearly written, well, we've yet to actually see the manuscript, but based on the reporting, she's written something where it's consenting adults, but they're engaged in a theoretical play which would otherwise be considered abhorrent. And the question is that, like, how far down the line of indecency does it go? There are plenty of books out there that are being sold in bookstores that cover, rather abhorrent material, but are being bought, sold, and consumed without consent. Yet here we go, we've got an author that's facing time for something that's weird. Now, if it was written from a non-consensual viewpoint, where they weren't consensual adults, yeah, I could quite clearly understand why there'd be outrage over it. The role-playing as a toddler. Now, I don't know how far things go down the path of what they do, but it's led to the child abuse material charges, and she's now been found guilty of those charges, 3 of them. The determination was that the book sexually objectified children. Okay, I mean, I can understand the viewpoint on that. It certainly seems to be very much a subjective line. And, well, yeah, I mean, the reader's left with a description that creates a visual image in one's mind of an adult male engaging sexual activity with a young child. I mean, that's the age play. Yeah, is it appropriate to age play like that? Yeah, it sounds like clearly not. So she issued a pre-release of the novel before a complaint about its content was made to police, arrested, found 16 hard copies of the offending novel, she'll be sentenced later. All right, so that was really just the outcome of the court case. And I'm surprised that free speech advocates aren't more up in arms about this or fighting more on her behalf. Australia's had a very strange relationship with what is considered excess or excessive pornography. There was a push back in the late 2000s, early 2010s to have things like was small breasts in particular. They were trying to ban those from porn in Australia because the claim being made was that it implied that the performer was underage, or it was indicating an age younger than they were. And people rightly complained, saying that, hey, look, adult females have breasts in all shapes and sizes. Just because they're small doesn't mean that it's an indication of sexual immaturity. There were also certain fetish elements that were being considered, and I mean, nowadays some stuff would be considered fairly mainstream, but at the time was very much fetishized, and was discussion about it being banned at the national level. Now, each of the states have their own slightly different approach, and obviously the internet being the internet, people get access to a whole bunch of things, and so a lot of that content is available, well, pretty much anywhere. The idea that child abuse material, child sex abuse material in the written word or in the fictitious world is considered on the same level as the real stuff. Well, there's been cases in the past that this has been the case, and that characters could be considered real people. Well, that's a bit of a push, given that they were indicating or representing clearly fictitious characters, but it explains why this idea of a fictitious environment is treated the same as if it was real, which puts a bit more context into why this author is now being found guilty of child abuse material, because of the understanding that the fictitious environment is the same as the real one. Is that a fair position to take? Well, I know people have argued back and forth over it when these earlier cases took place, but clearly it's still going on. Is it the right thing or the wrong thing? Well, I mean, it talks about, zoophilia as being a banned content in Australia. The content of some of the most popular books on sale in bookstores now, and that have attracted attention of various commentators around the world over the last few months, would very much borderline on the description of zoophilia, but it's allowed to be sold and consumed without issue, same as certain levels of BDSM content. Had that it been enforced in the same way, then it's likely that books like 50 Shades of Grey would never have been permitted to go on sale, let alone go on sale openly in everyday bookshops. So it feels like to some people that there's this discrepancy in how the laws are applied, or an unevenness in how they're applied. And this sticks up as an example of it being heavy-handed in one regard and completely non-existent in others. Again, she's yet to be sentenced, but it's clear that the court in New South Wales, at least, has determined that the presenting of fictitious age play between fictitious consenting adults is on par with the production of real child abuse material. And as it showed on the Wikipedia article, it falls in line with the sort of decisions that have been made in the past by in various court cases. All right, that's enough on that one. I wasn't initially planning to go back to that. Another follow-up. There's another follow-up article to stuff that I've been talking about in the past. I talked about previously issues surrounding robo-debt, which was a policy or an implementation of a system to attempt to overcome welfare fraud. And its automated systems went a little bit haywire. Well, they did what they were told to do. Whether or not that was the right thing, probably not. But it led to some serious real-world outcomes, including loss of lives, sorry, I was just hearing something outside the headphones. Led to a range of serious real-world outcomes. And it was then found that it, despite claims to the contrary early on, it was a fault of the system. And as a result, the system was removed, people being hit with with claims to repay funds that did or didn't exist. Led to all sorts of problems. And it was called robo-debt, because basically it was a electronic system designed to try and claw back debt. There were various court cases and compensation payouts along the way. There's been a class action that's now gotten to the point where the government is going to pay the compensation amount, on the order of close to $500 million in compensation. Is it illegal and immoral? Well, it's one way of looking at it. I don't know. I mean, obviously, it's the lawyer that's is trying to drum up the case, but yeah, it's certainly a scandal, definitely a scandal. So yeah, $500 million, largest class action settlement in Australian history. While 100,000 Australians have already signed up for compensation, there could be quite a lot more that would miss out. And this comes down to how, I guess, class actions are put together. You need to be part of the class, and people are sort of automatically assumed to be part of the class when they're not being active participants, and as a result, they may miss out on part of the compensation payout. So yeah, the example here of somebody who was given a $5,500 debt notice for something which didn't exist, and most people at the time who were receiving this weren't running around with thousands of extra dollars in their bank account, so are living paycheck to paycheck or welfare payment to welfare payment or slightly less, and so to suddenly get these massive bills that were filled with threatening language didn't help. Really hurt people quite a fair bit. So yeah, the bloke said he was scared of the letter, scared of the content and how it was presented. So he's obviously one of these people that chasing it. I mean, there is $1.7 billion in welfare debts that people didn't owe. Well, revenue raising. But it unfortunately went after the most vulnerable sections of Australian population, people who were reliant or who were receiving welfare payments, and who probably most people would assume would be least likely to be capable of paying out. So initially he offered $350 in compensation for a $5,500 debt that he didn't owe, but he paid back. That was initially appealed. Yeah, just because the debt was found to be illegal doesn't make things right when they say, oh yeah, we did bad. So yeah, the drawback, and this is the problem, is that just because the settlement's now been arrived, if you're not part of the class action, haven't signed up to the class action, you're going to miss out on your opportunity for a piece of this compensation pie. Otherwise, your only chance would be to take legislation, take court action on your own behalf. I mean, I've been part of a handful of class action listings in Australia. Couple done without my knowledge, but I was part of the affected class, and so I was automatically enrolled in the class. Others, we were identified as being members of a class of aggrieved people, and were contacted by the lawyers saying this is what's going on, this is the expectation. Government or the agency that was being prosecuted has admitted fault, and you're potentially in line for a compensation or remediation. However, if you choose not to be part of the class, it doesn't stop you from taking court action later on. But the benefit of a class action is it allows more resources to be applied on behalf of the aggrieved population. So people who were victims of robo-debt, thankfully I wasn't, need to register themselves with Gordon Legal by 6th of March. So less than a month. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on potential financial compensation for the grief that people were put through. And if you don't register, then you can't participate. So whilst the settlement has been announced as how big it is, it hasn't necessarily been approved just yet, but it's getting there. Speaking of aggrieved populations, this came up a few days back. There was a couple of years ago, or a few years, might have been nearly a year or so ago, talk about alternative therapies for treatment of certain psychological conditions, primarily PTSD. The talk was about the trialing or the introduction of psychedelic therapies, microdosing MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine therapies. Now, in Australia at the time, none of those therapies had been approved, and none of those therapies had been, and I think cannabis as well. But I think it was more in terms of like THC oils, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But basically, the determinations at the time were that none of these alternative therapies were going to be approved. The TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, was saying, look, no, we're not going to approve trials or anything like that. There was promising trial results coming out of the US and I think Canada as well of the potential for some of these therapies to have effect in the treatment of treatment-resistant PTSD and depression, and I think there's another another illness that they were effective in as well. But PTSD was the big one, and it was interesting at the time from a number of viewpoints. One was, well, you're using what is in essence an illegal drug in all other uses for therapeutic purposes. Second is that a lot of the cohort who would be using it or initially identified for using it would be ex-military. So people who'd come out of an environment where any sort of drug use, illicit drug use, was very much frowned upon, not permitted, etc. So you're introducing a trial of therapy using a restricted drug on a class of people who, well, in theory, never went anywhere near it. Practice, probably some people did, but it was interesting at the time, and certainly there were approved treatments and everything else like EMDR, CBT, all that sort of stuff. But in the wake of the Royal Commission that recently happened, well, last year before, whenever it was, into veteran suicides and how defence handled, I guess, it was a cultural thing as well. But from a treatment perspective, these alternative therapies were shelved at the time. Now, I'd subsequently been made aware that ketamine therapy was proceeding in on a trial basis, but you needed to be part of the trial in order to receive it, and there was, well, it was obviously under trial, so there were no promises. Well, they weren't promising outcomes anyway, but part of the trial was to ascertain what effect it would have on resistant PTSD. Yeah, I think the trial was just PTSD patients. And microdosing of ketamine therapy under, I forget who was running it. I don't know, Sydney, I believe. But anyway, so they're turning up more money for rehabilitation. But the thing that was most interesting to come out of this was, okay, yeah, reintegrate social life, rehabilitation plans. DVA will also begin funding medicinal cannabis, MDMA, and psilocybin treatment where eligible, with funding to develop other modern treatment methods. Now, depending on where you were in the country, you could potentially, and I guess the sort of GP and specialists you were seeing, there was the potential to access THC oils, tinctures. Now, they were never fully approved or really approved. Didn't stop people from using them, but they were very rarely used by people, and people knew that they were sort of skirting legality when using them and engaging with them. But to have, I guess, a big step forward to say that, yeah, no, these things that were proposed a couple of years ago and seemed very promising in terms of their outcomes, we're now going to actually fund them, which is, I think, very progressive, and it's going to have an effect far beyond just Australia. Because realistically at the moment, these treatments are still in trial phases elsewhere in the world as well. If DVA here in Australia pours funding into it and it becomes accessible to PTSD sufferers that DVA look after, and it's shown to be effective, then that's going to provide a lot of evidence to other bodies around the world to allow these sort of treatments for their patients as well, be they military or otherwise. So it's a big step forward, not just for Australian PTSD sufferers, but also for people who suffer from the psychological conditions or psychiatric conditions that would benefit from these sort of treatments elsewhere in the world as well. So it's certainly something to be observed for. Funding, enhanced funding from now. Yoga, surf therapy, cooking lessons, short education courses, expand support, that's rehabilitation, reintegration. Medicinal cannabis for chronic pain and other illnesses. But this MDA and psilocybin treatment, which falls in line with how the ketamine therapies were being done as well, is for the worst cases, so the treatment-resistant cases. So I'm guessing the candidates will have to have gone through the various other gold standards of treatment, like EMDR, CBT. I mean, there's probably half a dozen treatment models that are considered gold standard for PTSD treatment. Things like exposure therapy, EMDR, CBT, family therapy. No, family. Yeah, I think it's called family therapy. And there's be another one as well that I can't think of at the moment. But yeah, so people who've been through that and are still continuing to suffer from their symptoms rather badly would potentially become viable candidates for this. So that'd be like I said, it'd be a good thing to see when it comes through. Social wellbeing activities worth up to $2,000 per person supported. Okay, accepted claim for compensation. So yeah, this means that it's only available for people who've already jumped through the hoops with DVA of getting accepted, which not as bad as the US VA system, but it can still be very difficult for Australian veterans who didn't have their conditions well documented whilst they're in the system, and having them accepted. And it's one of those weird things that when people are in, they want to hide the existence of these things because they know that they'll get given the flick, they'll be discharged. So it's almost a prisoner's dilemma as to whether or not you take steps to acknowledge the condition that you're suffering from, because the consequences could be very difficult. So yeah, it came out of reforms due to begin in July. It's come out of various other bits and pieces, and the other bits and other, like the commissions, royal commissions, and whatnot. Music lessons, art courses, community group memberships, sporting club memberships. Huh. Activities for medical treatment, travel, meals, and accommodation, of course, is already on offer. Would not be eligible. Yep, okay, fair enough. Loss of identity, reintegration, trying to stop people from being lost once cut free from defence. There's anything else worth noting here? Okay, so it said in 2023, first country in the world to permit authorised treatments using MDA and psilocybin. But yeah, accessing those was very difficult. And yes, it is extraordinarily expensive, especially the ketamine one, where basically my understanding from what having had described to me is that it's conducted under the direction of a psychiatrist, but you've got an anesthesiologist, I think, actually administering the ketamine under a sedation. So, yeah. They're basically saying that people who just non-resistant. So, yeah, a lot of people want to use these drugs too, but if there's a miracle cure for things like PTSD, we probably already have it. Yeah. Treatment is very intensive, involving prep sessions, multiple dosing sessions, and follow-up. Yeah, I mean, sounds like things like exposure work and EMDR, where you've got to dig through all the nasty stuff as it goes on. Yeah, so look, that's certainly a very interesting thing to see, and I guess, like I said, it's going to be very, very promising for not just Australian veterans and Australian patients. Oh, give me a second. A local just found out. Apparently, a local school went into lockdown. A bit weird. I'm sure that'll come to light later in the day. Huh. Yeah. Wonder why my phone was giving me all sorts of weird alerts. A very sort of thing that doesn't happen very often here in Australia. All right. There's other things we could dig into. I mean, there are three things to start off with. There's been we did talk last year about the CFMEU Commission of Inquiry that was happening in Queensland at the moment. They've obviously had another round of public hearings and engagement, and there's been a report released by Jeffrey Watson SC, which has been tendered to the commission, and they've obviously released bits of information regarding the report. And the report basically says that the CFMU had been very heavily involved, or there'd been elements within the CFMU that had been engaged in criminal conduct or corruption, that there'd been really rather unsavoury people linked to the union, and who were making buckets of money and engaged in criminal activity, and that these sort of things weren't going on without the knowledge, well, not necessarily all their activities, but that there were activities going on with the knowledge of I guess the union itself. And so the allegation, the assumption that the unions have been corrupt and heavily engaged with organised crime, well, they were saying, no, it wasn't us, we weren't involved. Well, this report that was tendered has basically said, well, yeah, they have. And that taxpayer money was being taken in corrupt payments, and yeah, it's not clean, not good. That there were standover people involved with becoming union delegates, and so the extortion, threats of industrial disruption. Well, the unions have been doing that for a while. Just depends on who's making the claim, whether they see it as extortion or standover or legitimate bargaining, legitimate negotiation. Cash for work, sham shifts. It was the threats of violence, etc. And this is why people had thought unions had gotten a bit too big for their boots. And probably it goes to explain a bit why the Labor Party eventually put them into administration, is that they got too big to control. And the funny thing is, okay, so whilst they're saying that John Setka was responsible at the time when a lot of this stuff was going on, well, not just then, I'm sure it'd been going on for longer than that, he certainly at one point stood up to the government, and that was over the COVID lockdown stuff and preventing union members from working during the lockdowns, probably because this would have threatened the cash flow that a lot of people were getting. It's one of those things that just seems to that there's this idea of the union as a wonderful representative body for collaborative bargaining and for allowing the worker to have a collaborative voice on par with the employer or government or whoever else is trying to manipulate things. Yet power tends to corrupt, and it led to this idea or this allegation that the unions then became infested with the organised crime, etc., and that it undid what the unions, or hurts the union's standings, really. The Victorian branch of the CFMEU is no longer a trade union, it's a crime syndicate. That after the union was placed in administration in August of 2024, threats were made against the life of the administrator. Threats were also made against ACTU secretary. Now, that was sort of covered previously, saying that, look, CFMEU wasn't just trying to do over the government or taxpayers or anything like that. They took offence or tried to consolidate their power at the cost of other unions at the same time. So they were pushing back against the presence and operations of groups of other unions like the ACTU, and that was covered in previous articles and previous reporting. And the actions of the CFMU could have cost this Victorian taxpayer around $15 billion, much of which has gone into the hands of criminals and organised crime gangs. Now, would a Victorian Commission, or would there have been a Victorian Commission courageous enough to get a report like this? Maybe it's only because of distance that Queensland is able to grab this report and provide details from it. I don't know that a Victorian government would have the courage, I guess, to put something like this down on record. And, well, he's raised the point that the Victorian government, weren't doing anything effective to bring the union back in line. Well, that plays into that as well. Now, some redactions. Yep, okay, so when an inquiry or a report, like something like this, or an investigation like this takes place, there needs to be, or there is, and I'm sure the Queensland inquiry's got it as well. This one of the early steps of what they do is they establish the terms of reference, and what that does is it sets parameters, it sets boundaries on what can and can't be asked. In other words, if the term of reference is limited to, I'm just trying to think of an example. No, just trying to think of a nice, clean example. Well, okay, the inquiry here into the CFMU probably would have, there would probably be a term of reference, and it'd be worth, I mean, you should be able to go and dig it up and have a look, in which would prevent the inquiry from investigating the actions of other unions, be it the ACTU or other unions in other industry sectors, unless the actions of that union or those specific actions were influenced or otherwise directed by the CFMEU. Because they want to keep a constraint on things. Because if you don't have a term of reference, well, how do you ensure that your investigators and your inquiry investigation is actually going to be on topic and carry it out efficiently? So, yeah, presumably public sector unions aren't being looked at unless the CFMU has somehow had an involvement in the actions or decisions made by those unions, in which case it may be appropriate to then investigate specifically those decisions and outcomes and whether they were unduly influenced, etc. For example. So this report that Jeffrey Watson did up presumably included material that was pertinent to the investigative work he carried out, but ultimately fell outside the terms of reference. And yes, it could be that you allow that to stand. Here, the administrator that had been appointed of the CFMU said, look, no, you've got to redact that stuff because it's outside terms of reference. Yeah, and he's come back and said, look, no, it's appropriate and pertinent. It needs to be kept in. I mean, it's a little bit of a procedural thing, but it's also kind of important because there's key elements of key information that's probably going to help set the overall scene for what's going on and understanding of what's taking place. But because it was outside the terms of reference, it's almost like, well, you can't look at it. It's evidence that you're not allowed to see because it wasn't gathered properly, or it doesn't come from an appropriate source, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, the redactions, I mean, and the administrators also said the documents serious allegations of criminal and improper conduct. That's what it sounds like, but it hasn't been tested through criminal proceedings or determined by court. And this is like why reporting media say it is alleged that it is. I mean, you can see with your own two eyes that something took place, but no, it's alleged that this took place by this person or this group, at least until such time as a finding is made in a court of law. Because otherwise people say, well, no, it's misrepresenting what you've been seeing, you're not seeing the whole picture, there's extenuating circumstances, blah, 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 blah. You're associating intent, all this sort of stuff. So it's why it's why media can be frustrating sometimes from reporting on crimes. It's so-and-so was alleged to have done it, still holding the murder weapon, covered in the person's blood, saying, I did it, I did it, I did it. But no, they're alleged to have done it until time that the court judicial proceedings are finished. I mean, in essence, you're saying what the police are saying, which is the allegation is that this person did it. It's not their place to make a finding of responsibility. It's their place to gather evidence and pass that along for the prosecutors, etc. So yeah, the report will be referred to the AFP, the Fair Work Commission, law enforcement agencies and regulators, so they may do their own independent inquiries and take whatever enforcement action, blah. Okay, Victorian government says we're good, we've never done anything bad, of course. And yeah, obviously people are running around saying, oh, it wasn't us, we're not involved in it. So it's also led to, I mean, there's a handful of articles that came out in relation to the CFMU stuff at the moment. Okay, the Sydney Morning Herald had a copy. I mean, I'm not subscribed on this account, but yeah, it goes into the report. And then there's also the federal opposition calling for the administrator to be sacked. Yeah, it's all sorts of fun and arguing. Fun. All right. We're going to move on to, I guess, one more thing, I think, today. We're going to look at housing affordability, cost of living stuff we've definitely been looking at a lot so far on this channel during our Just Chatting streams. And these articles are a little bit older. Well, not older than previous, but they're going back a couple of weeks as well. It's showing that the considerations and the concerns and the facts, the figures are still there. They're continuing. One of the big things that has been proposed as helping to help of housing affordability or available housing stock would be for the development of more no, not that. The development of more apartments of higher density living, higher density housing. And I mean, you see examples of people say, well, I don't want new apartment blocks in my backyard. No, we want to keep our low to medium density living. Thank you very much. No, the infrastructure is not there to support this higher density thing. So, yeah, increasing supply. Everyone talks, look, if you build more houses, build more apartments, and more people can afford a place to live, hopefully that'll drag, not necessarily prices down, but make affordability a lot easier. And so, yep, the 1.2 million figure has been suggested for a while. And how they're going to do that within the constraints of existing city space is, well, you have to increase density. You can't magic 1.2 million residences out of nothing and put them out in the boondocks. If people want to stay relatively close to employment and transport and infrastructure, then that residential areas will have to become higher density. All right, but obviously there's pushback on that. So apartment approvals have hit a high at the end of last year. All right, and you're seeing another spike again in taller apartment blocks. Obviously, there's a slump around COVID and the response. Well, there'd also been a decline post 2015. Probably 15, 20 years ago now would have been about here. I think this particular slump. I'm not sure if that's going to be 2008, but Australia was relatively insulated from the global financial crisis in terms of housing affordability. A few people lost out and things like that. There were articles, I remember There's a couple of case studies, a couple of examples given of people in Adelaide that had brought apartments down on the Glenelg foreshore, so one of the few places in Adelaide where there were relatively high density apartment living. They bought them off plan, and a place had been built, they'd moved in, and suddenly they found themselves in the position where the flow-on effects of the global financial crisis and the slump in apartment desirability meant that their apartments were below water in terms of valuation. And I mean, I think ultimately they've all caught up again, but there was certainly a period there of a couple of years where quite a lot of apartment holders, just by virtue of when those apartment blocks were built and completed, that in essence the entire building was suffering from the same thing the apartment values had created at the wrong time exactly. And there certainly were other apartment developments around Adelaide at the time undergoing the same sort of thing. And it was certainly a city that doesn't have massive numbers of high density apartment blocks. So the few that did come online all at the same time, suddenly finding themselves slumped for value, sort of stood out. This slump post 2015, I mean, I sort of remember people getting like sick of the idea of your only option is a tiny little apartment. Well, if there's no land coming online and you still want to live close by, you gotta live in high density. So rezoning impacts housing affordability. Okay, train stations. Blah, 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 blah. There should be a statement in here about okay, proportion of households with a gross yearly income of $50,000, so lower income families, rose from 15% 91 to 21% 96. Okay, that's years back, but that's all massively increased in the last 10 to 15 years. Well, see, part of the issue here that they're talking about affordable housing units, etc. Certainly in the centre of Sydney, there are a very few affordable housing units, public housing units as such, and people tend to be really want to really tightly hang on to that because, well, if they were to be commercially redeveloped, the public housing tenant would be well and truly priced out. So, affordable housing program generally restricts eligibility to households with a gross income of less than $138,000, though other factors such as links to the area can be taken into account. I mean, it's still a reasonable income, but when you're talking about living in, say, the city of Sydney, yeah, that's not going to get you very far. And yeah, affordable housing would be is the next step up from social housing, effectively. But saying that these apartments aren't affordable, I mean, a one-bedroom apartment in Waterloo, they're going to give me a price? No, they're not. But the thing is that people are saying, well, areas such as Mascot and Green Square in Sydney or the Docklands in Melbourne, no one would consider them affordable. I mean, they're high desirable areas, and so they're just slightly less expensive than more expensive areas, but they're still expensive. And so affordable housing, well, it's going to be reduced in those areas if you've got lots of other people willing to move in and pay the money. Yeah, it just means that you're running out of affordability. I mean, it's 15 years, things have doubled in price. Yeah, which makes sense, slightly more than doubled in price. But that's coming out of COVID. It doesn't surprise me that you're looking at $1 million for an apartment in that part of Sydney. That, yeah, 15, 20 years ago was half or less. That's really not that surprising. I mean, I don't know why people were complaining and up in arms about it, apart from the fact that people's incomes haven't kept up, and therefore this represents more than 10 times what a low-income earner is earning. And yes, it does price people out of locations. Yes, it does force your lower income workers to move out of regions and move out of areas. That's part of the problem, part of the plague, that they're trying to cap affordable housing, etc., and that doesn't really exist. The fact Docklands didn't go up very high suggests that it was overpriced to begin with. But yeah, supply doesn't equal affordability because desirability takes over. So yeah, it's difficult to say. And the apartments don't help families. A bit hard to squeeze larger families into smaller apartments. People saying, "Oh, we want these mid-rise, medium density type units and housing." The Northern European model is interesting. The example I'm thinking of is Norwegian, where they've got these apartment buildings, but it's not just lots of tiny little apartments. It's actually a lot of 4-bedroom units spread across 2 floors. So basically you'd have the front half of the facade on this floor would be the front part of a 4-bedroom to go back, and then the back half of the building is the lower part. And then there'd be like an overlapped other 4-bedroom apartment that would have their top floor at the back and their bottom floor at the front. You'd have decent lighting, you'd have decent amount of space, but it is still technically an apartment. And in that space, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You'd have 8 4-bedroom apartments that were on par with basically a pretty decent 4-bedroom house, standalone house, but in the footprint of not much more than a 4-bedroom house to begin with. And so, you increase the density, but you're still getting the amount of space. Whereas a lot of the apartment blocks are being built as each one of these would be, well, top floor maybe a bit more, but you'd be lucky to have a couple of windows per apartment, and you'd have a lot more apartments jammed in. But yeah, you go and find an affordable 4-bedroom apartment anywhere, good luck. Or unit. So yeah, increasing townhouses, increasing medium density. You could add 1 million plus more homes in the Sydney region if you allowed it without approvals. Yeah, I don't know. That's going to lead to problems with infrastructure, but it's difficult there. But housing affordability is just one thing. Cost of living is a big thing. So people having to make decisions about where their limited pay packet goes. Living costs rose in the quarter. Annual increases ranging from 2.3 to 4.2%. Yet I'm sure that they're going to come out with an annual increase of like 2.4%, which will be what people's pay goes up by for in that sort of thing. So high housing and food costs, not a surprise. So it tracked changes in households' out-of-pocket expenses, seeing how rising costs have felt day to day. Cost of living increases. So those relying on government payments, including pensioner and beneficiary households, recorded the largest rise in living costs, with living costs rising by 4.1 to 4.2%. Guarantee you that government payments are not going up by 4.1 to 4.2% per year annum. Driven in part by high electricity prices as rebates sort of went away. Employee-based households only saw their stuff go up by 2.3%. So, annual percentage change in excess of 3% for a lot of people, 2.3. So I think that's the one that they're going to say, oh, look, we'll put up our government payments by 2.3%. And its mortgage interest charge changes, but that's going to go up now that the interest rate's gone up as well. So that's going to impact living costs as well. So housing costs had a 21% jump in electricity prices. Yeah, the electricity bill was a bit of a rude shock, even though consumption hadn't really changed and was fairly efficient. Yeah, they're like, nah, pay us tons more. Rents went up by 4%. Now, if you're renting, you're going to feel that 4% increase. 3.5% to food. Clothing and footwear 3.5%. Housing 5%. Health 3.6%. It seems like private health providers get this annual increase that gets signed off on, and they charge the max percent increase every time, but their quality of service delivery doesn't seem to have changed. Transport and communications didn't really go up. Education 5%. Yeah, I can see that. And recreational costs up by 4%. Yeah, okay, I can see that as well. Holiday and costs 5.8%. Yeah. Domestic travel 10%. Yeah, okay, so I went through, I don't know if I went through it on an earlier Just Chatting stream, but it's possible. There was a figure in the CPI basket or in the annual thing. It might have been a couple of years ago now. I was looking at it, where 98% of the cost of living goods, or the items in the CPI basket, had rocketed it up. And the one thing that stood out as having fallen was international travel. It was the cost for international travel. And this was not long after the end of COVID. So the airlines and cruise lines and other international travel costs were low because they were trying to get people back to it. They were trying to encourage traveller numbers back up again. And so costs or prices had decreased in order to incentivize people to come back. Now, I don't know why people thought that was going to be a permanent thing, but what it had done was it suppressed the increase in cost of living experienced everywhere else. And the point I was making at the time was that people aren't going to discretionary spend on overseas travel if they can't afford to, because all their money is being taken up by increases in fuel, electricity, rent, insurance, food, but that have all increased by 5 to 10%. But the government then says, oh, no, it's only a 2.2% increase because the fall in overseas travel costs has offset it. It's like, well, people aren't taking overseas travel because they can't afford to. Because the real increase, or they've felt what is the experienced increase in day-to-day living costs, doesn't match up with the claims of annual cost of living stuff. So the idea that international travel and accommodation has jumped 24%, yeah, not surprising. I think that's just them finally returning to what their normal baseline is. It was a suppressed baseline. It was a suppressed cost for a couple of years as they try to get people back. So yeah, not a surprise. So that's obviously going to contribute to things as well. Lower electricity and health costs, I don't believe that's the case. Interest rate rise will squeeze households further. Yes, charities saying, look, it's hard to keep up and that it's going to be more difficult for people. Yep. So yeah, like it's when the basics are a struggle, who has discretionary funds for the luxuries? Oh, look, luxury spending's going down. Costs are going down. Yeah, because people can't afford it. So, yeah, I don't know that sometimes the way they calculate these figures is really reflective of how people experience living costs. And I mean, one of the things in New South Wales that I know I talked about previously that has been an impact to that is this idea of portable bonds, as in you pay your bond once, and if you're renting, that bond can travel with you, or it's held at the bond agency and is just then reallocated to the new landlord, provided you don't get it taken off you. Yet they missed, I mean, this is from a couple of weeks back, but the deadline to get it delivered was the end of last year. And, well, they've made progress, but, well, they've missed the target, so it's going to be coming up. So that means renters in New South Wales, are still going to have to basically have 2 bonds worth of money floating around, one currently secured, and the second would be what they then need should they have to move, so that they have a bond in place, which obviously is an additional financial stress because you could either have that money sitting aside untouched and ready to go, which is basically in enforced savings, or if you're living bill to bill, paycheck to paycheck, you're going to probably burn through that reserve, but then working out how you're going to come up with an actual bond payment along the way. When you've already got bond money already sitting there, you know that it's going to get moved, it's going to show up. Well, how do you do it? Now, it makes sense to say, look, you pay one bond into the system, into a managed system. You can shift that bond around when you shift around. Great idea. Saves financial stress, saves problems, gives more mobility to renters, more flexibility, their ability to move around things. But yeah, they're saying it's a fairly complicated system in the background, and so their systems weren't quite ready in time, and so they're still coming through with it. It just wasn't going to take place in time. Obviously, then people like the Greens are coming out and saying, well, you haven't done enough. You've got to actually deliver on the reform. Can't just say you've done a good thing. And obviously people are concerned about how it's actually going to work, given that it's not actually working just yet. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It sounds like it's still progressing, and they're still working on it, and it's still pushing forward. Since we're looking at cost of living stuff, and I think we'll look at this as the last one today. There's a few other things I could look at, but so I think there was another article somewhere. No, I can't see it. Okay, how capacity constraints are linked to inflation in your hip pocket. Okay, this is from yesterday. Capacity constraints. Okay. What this talks about is supply and demand curves and things like this, and how they try and take into account capacity, really. In the context when they're talking about capacity in these terms, they're talking about, I guess, headroom, excess capacity. So what it's saying is that, look, if I needed to surge production or storage or sale of goods or anything like that, I've got the resources on hand, be it labor, storage, shelf space, whatever, to be able to put those goods on display, to deliver those additional services, to deliver that additional capacity. It's the headroom. It's the whilst you want to be running your system as close to capacity as possible, because it's more efficient, you want a little bit of headroom left. You want a little bit of flexibility still built into it to allow for a sudden production rise, a sudden delivery of new goods, surge of capacity, surge of purchases, all those sorts of reasons why you may just want this little bit of extra capacity built in. It's flex. It gives you the ability to respond to things. Now, if you're already running at full capacity and something goes wrong or something changes, you're not going to be able to respond as quickly because you have to sort of wind back for a little bit, make the changes, and then recommit. So, yeah, you want a little bit of spare capacity to allow, I guess, self-regulation, allow these excesses in production, shortfalls in production, to be absorbed by the system. If you've got excess stock on shelf, then when there's a shortfall in production, the consumer doesn't see that because they're still purchasing at the same rate. They just eat up the spare capacity that you've used up until things fall back to a regular level. That sort of thing. It's one of the, I guess, in a manufacturing perspective, it's that battle between just-in-time production and warehousing. Just-in-time production is you're trying to minimize the period between producing a good and it being delivered to by a supplier and being delivered for elsewhere in the production chain, or to where the demand is, versus producing 1,000 odd widgets. When the demand is for 90 widgets, the rest will then sit on a shelf in a warehouse until the capacity is used up, and therefore your production lines slow down, all sorts of bits and pieces. You run your production line efficiently to only produce the materials you need and needed by the customer. The drawback to just-in-time production, and I think this is one of the things that came out of, I'm pretty sure it's the Toyota system back in the day. One of the things that came out of just-in-time production, and the problem is a failure in a production pipeline can have catastrophic downstream effects with integrators and stuff. So if you're relying on several different suppliers and one of them has an outage and you're all operating on a just-in-time production delivery system, your reliability of your final product delivery is a factor of the reliability of each of those individual suppliers. And each of the suppliers, if they're supplying independent individual parts that aren't, you're not using two suppliers for the same part, your overall reliability of your production line is at least the worst of the reliabilities of the individual suppliers. Because one of those falls out, your production pipeline falls over because it's an integrator. And now you've got a backlog of stock building up from the other suppliers into warehousing that doesn't exist because no one's warehousing. And so their production lines grind to a halt because you're no longer taking delivery of their services and products because you can't take them because you've got no warehousing. And so there's a balance that is sought between the two, where you have maybe 7 days worth of production, maybe 14 days worth of production that is warehoused, and the rest is just in time. So material should be flowing in and out of warehousing at the same rate, such that you've got 2 weeks worth of stock on hand at any one time, so that if there's a downstream supplier outage or issue, that you have 2 weeks to get the issue resolved before your production line starts hurting. So that's enough time to source other suppliers, etc. But at the same time, you're not stuck with excess stock. Should you retool your production lines, redesigns, new models, etc., you're not having to find ways to creatively use months or years of stock on shelves that aren't going anywhere. All right. So capacity. If there's no spare capacity, you've got the same amount of money chasing goods that don't exist, so prices go up because demand is exceeding supply. Supply and demand curves. Good work. Yes, full capacity. You never want your economy. You need a. And this, I'm sure I've talked about this before with unemployment figures. you want to have a certain degree of unemployment in a healthy society because it gives employees mobility. If you're operating in a society with 0% unemployment, then your employee has, well, the upper hand. You can ask for higher and higher salaries because there's no one else to replace them. So they've got the upper hand in negotiations. But it also means that if there's no unemployment, then there's people not looking to move or to change jobs, all that sort of stuff. So it's a bit hard to have job listings if there's no people to fill them. So you want this certain level of open job listings because that gives people the ability to move, to relocate, change professions, upskill, whatever. But at the same time, you want I think it's like 2% unemployment is the perfect figure because it gives enough people moving in and out of the workforce to allow that natural churn and turnover. I mean, you've got people retiring, you've got people coming into the workforce for the first time, you've got people maybe taking extended leaves of absence, and so you've got these various demands on human capital that need to be accommodated by a certain degree of excess capacity. And that's where the 2% or this low unemployment rate comes in. Now, if your unemployment rate gets too high, then you've got far too much human capital chasing far too few jobs. And so the employers get the upper hand. But the problem is your employees or these unemployed people are still consumers. And if they're not getting income, then their ability to consume degrades. And so if they're purchasing less, then companies have to produce less. And if companies are producing less, then they can't afford to keep their staff on. They're going to start firing staff. And so your unemployment figures go up. It's a problem in big factory towns, for example. If whatever the widget that the big factory is producing suddenly is unwanted, you could potentially see the entire factory shut down. Now, if the factory shuts down, the whole town could go out of existence because all the other industries and services in town are very much reliant on the fact that these factory workers are getting paid well and they're able to spend money in town. That goes away, then there's no one to support the other industries. There's not enough inherent support in the system to do it. And that's why you see Rust Belt cities, for example, former industrial towns, things like that, where the major manufacturer generally has shut down and left town, and the town has slumped and never really recovered as a result. Mining towns where the mine is shut down, all that sort of stuff. There's plenty of examples out there where that sort of stuff takes place. Okay. Which is pretty much what I just said here. Okay, so if there's precisely the right number of workers and goods, then the economy is in equilibrium. However, you need a reserve army of workers, crucially meeting demand for skilled labourers that's needed, i.e., you need a certain amount of unemployment, this reserve army of workers, the unemployed, the capable unemployed, that is. So you want to have that, but at the same time, you want to avoid situations where your employment is inefficient. So people working underutilized, working too few hours, not getting paid enough, all that sort of stuff. Because on the books, they look like they're full-time employees or they're taking up FTE, but the economic value is a lot less than it could be. And then a consumer that can't consume as much, which is a problem, obviously. Yep. If, like in any given sector, there's not enough skilled labour or the right kind of technology or machinery, reduce what the nation needs without business costs rising significantly to meet that demand. Okay, yeah, if you don't have enough people or goods and bits and pieces, you got to pay more to attract what is out there. Surprise, surprise. So it's suffering from capacity constraints. Yep, how you release the pressure, pay more. make things cost more. So yeah, by raising consumer prices, consumers spend less, leaves them unsatisfied, but it reduces demand. Now, or you can increase production, but you can't increase production if you don't have that reserve employment capacity or the reserve technological capacity. Yeah. And so it's inefficient if things, but it's, like I said, this balance, this capacity. So it's a capacity constraint. Yeah, I mean, the concept, the words you may not have understood, but I think most people understand the concept of why that is the case. So, yeah. And then things like regulation can impact that. It'll slow down rate of production and slow down things because it imposes an external constraint on how fast things can be done or how efficient things can be done. It can also improve it, also ensure better worker conditions, better workplace conditions, better technology, better environmental management, all these sort of bits and pieces. That's all knitted together, but it also has an impact on what you can and can't do. Higher environmental costs in higher developed societies are avoided by sourcing materials from societies where they don't care so much about environmental impact or worker safety, and so they cut the corners. They save costs in those regions, lower cost of goods. Yeah, can't compete, all that sort of stuff. So productivity, key to capacity. Yep, if you're more productive, you can do more with less, and therefore your capacity, your theoretical capacity changes. Surprise, surprise. But they're saying that we've got tight labour markets at the moment, and that's sort of in some regards that's the case. There are some fields where that's definitely the case. I mean, there's still quite a lot of recent university graduates who are still hurting for work. So whilst it may be a tight employment field, that may be more for more experienced workforce. But if you can't get in at the initial level, well, you're never going to become a more experienced worker now, are you? All right. I think that'll be it for today. I mean, we covered a fair bit. So let's drop in a chat, close things out. All right. Big thank you to everyone coming out. Regulars, first timers, chatters, lurkers, across all the various endpoints and the channels. Thank you very much for being here. The channel and content wouldn't be the same without you. So thank you very much for that. All right, what do we got next? The next stream we're looking at doing is a gaming stream. We're back on our Prince of Persia Sands of Time trilogy, which is, we're on the Prince of Persia The Two Thrones, and that's going to be tomorrow night. Then Saturday night, we've got our multiplayer stream from Minecraft SMP. Sunday night, we're doing the arena mode in Infamous First Light. Monday night, Mass Effect 1 Insanity Run, nearly done. And then we're going to be doing the Adept and Engineer trophies. Wednesday night, Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. And then we'll be looking at some other Just Chatting streams from there. We also have giveaways running every Sunday. That gets drawn before Sunday's stream. This week it is for a copy of Wildmender. If you'd like a chance at winning that, head for the Discord. You'll find a giveaway channel. Head in there, click the blue button, automatically the draw that happens before every Sunday stream. What else do we have coming up? If you want to keep on top of what's happening when, follow the socials, mainly Twitter and Insta. Messages go out both of those before each stream, indicating what we're when. Followed by the Discord also picking up and sending out messages when the stream goes live, as well as the stream of some of our friends over there as well. If you want to keep on top of things, that's probably the best place to do it. Other than that, very good afternoon. A very good day from me to all of you. And we'll see you all again next stream.